2005 you secured the funding for the
Yeah.
schools, and we're now, 2024? So we're well down the line, almost 20 years since then.
Yeah.
I mean, what have you learned about children adopting spirituality? I mean, we can talk about what we learn about children. That's a whole talk by itself.
Yeah.
But children adopting spirituality, is it natural? Because I think in the modern day, people think that spirituality is more subjective and something that you learn through life experiences, whereas from what I understand of the Avanti schools, it's very much that it's yes, it's innately there, and experiences bring it out, but also that there needs to be a structured learning around spirituality. And so maybe some lessons that you've learned about kids adopting spirituality in schools.
Yeah. The
The challenges even.
And to your point, like just there's this one sense about adopting in terms of taking it up, but you mentioned this point about actually it being internal, and as we say often, like educare, like the root word for education is this idea of drawing out what's already within, right? So like that's a principle of education. It's a fundamental kind of view on education.
Even in the secular sense.
Yeah. So the word education itself is coming from educare. So like the idea of spirituality in that sense is extremely kind of matched with education. The
Right.
whole notion of discovering oneself and allowing that to come forth. And that's that's the beautiful aspect of education. That's why I feel so. Initially I didn't, because my journey through education was a interesting story. Maybe
That's not on the bio.
yeah, it's not on the bio. Yeah, dropping out of med school and stuff. So like but the setting of an educational institution, the power of an educational institution to be able to facilitate a child's exploration of themselves, a child's flourishing in terms of who they are, and obviously at a profound level, as opposed to the kind of superficial layers of identity that we have, and then being able to take that and impact the world as a consequence of that. That I think is just, I mean, what could be more exciting than that? And I think that with children and young people in education, they have less inhibitions about that, particularly generally. I'm saying, obviously it's a generalization, but there are opportunities to be able to turn their mind towards that at an early stage, where habits can be formed, to your point about adopting it, and what does that look like in practice. That habits can be formed, that values can be formed around actually what's important in my life, what do I value really, and what am I going to direct my life towards. All of these types of things, they can come, obviously they can come as we grow older and into our adult life. But if those habits, and we know, right, like those habits, those, in Sanskrit we call them samskaras, this kind of impressions, if those impressions are built in early on, it's so much easier for them to then relate to that, to then, if you're going through a rough patch, what do you turn to?
Right.
So like, and if you've practiced meditation, you've practiced yoga, you've practiced spirituality from 4 years up, which is what we do in our schools, then maybe you'll turn to that as opposed to some other stuff which is not so helpful.
Have you seen that happen? Like, for example, you started with your son, and he's gone through the process, gone through the journey. I mean, speaking from the father's perspective, do you notice that your son is now in the moments of harsh realities of life? Is he turning towards that internal space?
Yeah, it's a good question. So he was part of that first cohort who started in our first school in 2008. So they were the first group that actually graduated, who went from reception year, age 4, and graduated age 18 from year 13 in our secondary school. So that we actually did a mini film on that cohort, because what we wanted to see was what was it like for that group, because
starting
they were
from the beginning.
Yeah, starting from what is, because that's the system that they've known, the Avanti education system, and going through those experiences. And it is very fair to say that group was definitely a guinea pig set, right? Like, so we as me personally, but also several of us involved at the time, we didn't have a clue about education at the time. So we were learning as we went. Fortunately for us, we had some fantastic educationalists around us who made who made it what it is. But yeah, does he turn to it now? Um, I think that whole cohort turns to it, and I think it really shines through in the interviews that we did with them, and that's on YouTube, and this idea of what did you gain from an Avanti education that really helps you in your life today.
Wow.
And they talk about these things. They talk about the spirituality. They talk about the values that they've really inculcated and try to practice. They talk about their reference points in terms of, our view, our worldview. Like, what do we, how do we want to engage with the world? So all of these things are foundational. We take it sometimes for granted that it's kind of generic and completely objective, but it's not. I mean, it's very personal, a lot of these things. And we can build upon it.
That's a really interesting point that you mentioned, that it's really personal, because I think oftentimes we think of schools as being machines where you bring out the same result each time. Because, as a parent, I'm looking at schools based on the results which they bring the child at the end of the and they all have to come out straight A students, and they all have to be incredibly, morally and ethically well stabilized and situated. And I think that that's really interesting that you've talked about spirituality as being something that's innately there, and that through a system of education we can get our youth, our children, to understand that that's something that they can turn to, and then more so that it's still personal, that it's not uniform and it's not robotic, and spirituality is not about being in the box per se, but that it can be whatever it looks like externally, but yeah, it's still a very personal thing.
Yeah, yeah.